Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining in. I have Puneeth with us for this session. So, Puneeth is a partner in the Public Policy and Regulatory Affairs team at Shardul Amarchand Mangaldas. He works on a range of regulatory matters with a specialization in data governance, data privacy, cybersecurity, regulation of AI, and telecom. He has a profound understanding of the DPDP Act and the law, as well as the legislative process. In fact, he was invited to testify before the Joint Parliamentary Committee examining the Personal Data Protection Bill way back in 2019. So we really have an expert here. And thank you so much for taking out the time to come and talk to us.
Thanks, Pushkal, and thanks for the very kind introduction. I hope I don't have too many profound thoughts today.
Of course. And I was saying this earlier, we had taken your time to talk about the rules that were supposed to come out, and we were really excited to talk about the rules, but they have not come out yet. And instead of us also postponing our session, we thought that it would be great to use your time instead to talk about some understanding some core concepts in the law, such as consent and personal information. And that is what we will be talking about today. Okay, for the audiences, we have a really senior tech lawyer in our midst, and I'm sure that there are a lot of questions that you would have around consent and personal data. We are going to try our best to showcase those questions, but this session is supposed to be a freewheeling discussion, right? So we will also be looking out to our audience to make it interesting with great questions. All the technical and compliance folks, this is a great opportunity that Puneeth has made available for us. So please make your questions really strategic and place them in the chat box. And we will try our best to answer those questions, to try our best to ask those questions and get Puneeth to answer them. So with that, without much further ado, let's dive in. Puneeth, since this session was supposed to be about the rules, let's start by talking about the rules. When we are talking to our prospects and we are having all of these conversations, we hear a lot that we are waiting for the rules to come out before we start doing something about this. And we, of course, often say that there's a long road to compliance. But according to you, what should companies be doing right now?
Thanks, Pushkal, and it's a question we receive all the time as well. I don't think that's the best approach to wait for the rules to come out because the ministry has been very clear by Minister Meti. It's been very clear that there's not going to be any further clarity that's going to come out. So if you look at the draft rules and the DPDP Act, it's clear that it's going to be a principle-based framework. So it's not there'll be some magical solve for any of the problems you're facing once a DPDP rules come out. If I follow in the news reports, it's mainly on a couple of questions that stuck, and those are not issues that affect most businesses. On this date, as in I've seen most companies have already started complying with the rules or putting in place measures. And the reason you should do this is most of this compliance is not strictly legal. A lot of it is about just organizing your data internally, which we find that a lot of companies have a little bit of trouble doing that, or putting in place measures to set up access control measures, figuring out ways to take consent. Because again, if you think of compliance, we've broadly seen two or three types of companies where if you're, for instance, GDPR compliant already, this has like minor incremental changes. It's the same with SPDI compliance. What the DPDP does is it forces you to shift your thinking in terms of enforcement because a lot of what's here principally is kind of there in the SPDI rules, but the DPDP Act comes with teeth, right?
Yeah.
And the second, I think, which is the most important, is a sort of shifting culture. I think you have to align your processes internally in terms of figuring out doing a data mapping exercise, figuring out your customer relationship management software, how do you interface with customers and vendors. I think that's the tricky part, and which is why you should not really be waiting for the rules to come out, though that's what you are gathered here to discuss.
Got it. Yeah, I think very succinctly and clearly put, there's a lot of changes that you're going to have to make technically and operationally. It's best to start working on those changes right now and also start taking stock, do your data mapping across the board. This, as you said, the minister has confirmed that with the rules will not impact any of this basic stuff, and this basic stuff will take a lot of time. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. At this point, we have a poll for our audience. What stage of preparedness are you at? So if you can provide your responses to the poll, this is just to get a sense of how we are doing in the market. We'll be happy to share the results of these polls with you all after the session so that you also get a sense of where everybody is at. Of course, this poll is anonymous and we'll share the data only in aggregate. So thanks for that, Puneeth. I think that is all we get to talk about the rules today. I don't want to get into some speculative business about what do you think they will contain and all of that. I think that is something that we should leave for later. But while we have you, one core question when we start doing this exercise that a lot of businesses face is that, all right, fine, I'm supposed to protect PII, but what is PII, right? The definition is not clearly there. Often people are asking for, is there a list somewhere where I can find PII and where I can find the list of PII? Or people say also ask questions about, there are some very distinct or like very unidentifiable almost attributes that I'm storing about this person. Is this attribute PII? So we know that there is a lot of legal discourse and theory around what constitutes PII. But if you had to give a very simple thumb rule that I can explain to my developer or my product manager or my operations person as part of their employee training, then how would you define it in the simplest sense?
Again, this is, I would also say, a very, at least from a legal perspective, it's a fairly straightforward answer. Is it's simply data with which you can identify someone, or data in relation to which you can identify someone. I think what you're referring to is this in relation part, which is again a new concept, because under SPDI, you either had this personal information definition or the SPDI, where you enumerated 9 categories and you said those would be the sort of data points for which you have to collect consent. Now, when you say in relation to, it simply comes down to whether when you combine it with another data, when you use it in a particular context, you can identify a person. And so if you're thinking internally on the kinds of data you sit on, it might not help identify someone just in and of itself. But if you, for instance, use it to personalize a particular kind of service, if you're using it to provide a service that requires identifying someone inherently, I think that's where you need to start thinking about consent and think about it as personal data. So to give you a very clear example, I think address, right? So for instance, you could argue that if I simply have someone's address, it's not personal information, because in an apartment buildings, there could be 100 people. But if someone is signed up to your e-commerce platform, your delivery platform, you already have a certain amount of data with you, right? So you already have, for instance, maybe my name, my phone number. So the moment you combine address with that, it does help you identify someone. So identifying me in relation to the address, including the data you already hold on me, which is why you shouldn't look at these data categories in isolation. The test is very much, I sit on this data, but I sit on it with everything else. And I think even if you look at the way data is stored in most companies, they don't operate in silos, right? So to the extent that you're looking, if you have data about a customer, it helps you provide services to that specific customer. I think you should consider that as personal information.
Sure. So if you are able to use a nondescript identifier along with other identifiers, then you should consider it personal data. But doesn't that make the definition a bit ambiguous? Where I don't know right now which identifier I'm going to use later. Or I don't know, using, let's say, about five, six, seven identifiers, maybe your sex, your age group that you're in, your PIN code, identifiers which by themselves are nondescript and together if I do some operations on them, if I apply some algorithms upon them, I can predict a lot of traits about you to a very high degree of specificity. In that case, is this personal data? Even, I mean, if I have some nondescript identifiers, is that personal data?
So again, we're jumping a couple of steps here. You have to go back to the purpose for which you're using this data. So in your example, if I'm running various sort of say processing activities, which is like running algorithms and stuff on it, what is the purpose you're doing it for, right? Is it simply to improve the software you're running within your internal applications? Are you trying to clean house, and are you using it for purely internal purposes to improve your accounting service or anything like that? Then it's a different question. But if you're using it to inform how you service a client, right? So say I'm a food delivery app and I take a bunch of anonymized addresses, but I run a bunch of algorithms to figure out, hey, like this in this particular neighborhood, this is the dish that I need to deliver at this time for the best sort of payoff. In that situation, it's hard to argue that they're not using that to personalize or bring it down to the level at which. So again, I don't think in the way you deliver services, you're going to silo it the way. So I think that question also is a bit, I don't know if that's a real world question to the extent to which sometimes we receive it, because the way if you're using it to deliver services in that very holistic way, you have to think of the data also in those terms.
Right. Sure. Is it fair to say that personal data, any data point is personal data based on the purpose for which you're going to use it? If you're maintaining logs in your application that are used internally and disclosed to nobody, and they are used maybe for your uptime or checking like antivirus protection or something like that. then it may not be personal data. But as soon as you use that towards a business purpose, or as soon as you start using that data to actually identify somebody more and more with that goal in mind, then it becomes personal data. So would you say it's a subjective call about the goal with which you're using the data?
Yes, it is very subjective. I want to sort of caveat that because we hear this from like product people, but then when we come down to the brass tacks, sometimes we find that hey, there is some level of customization. But yes, as you were saying, if you're using it to improve your services, using it to improve uptime, error reporting, and things like that, broadly okay. But even in those services, at times we have, I just want to caveat by saying because that is all that also comes back down to personalization, customization at some point. Of course, we've also encountered businesses that operate at the other end of the spectrum where they do no sort of customization. It's purely just a software layer on top of an offline business. In those sort of situations, I think you can say we're not really using this for to target a particular customer.
Got it. Yeah, that's super interesting because if I'm a large enterprise and I have a lot of like transactional logs that are not useful for me right now, they may be useful for me later. And at a later point, I may find ways to monetize them or use them for some sort of targeting. So it is critical for that large enterprise to know when exactly to collect consent for it and when exactly to call it personal data and when it is not relevant. So thanks for that. And that's what my next topic is going to be. It's going to be about consent, and I had some of my own questions to ask you, but I think there are some interesting. There's one interesting question here which I would want to ask you. So yeah, employee consent, right? I think is when you are onboarding an employee or around the whole employee onboarding process from when they are a candidate and then when they become an employee, then if you have to get them a birthday cake or something like that. There are so many of these use cases. When do you collect consent from this person? When do you not have to collect consent from this person? What is the simple like thumb rule to approach this problem?
I want to tell you that this is not the first birthday question I've encountered. This happens to be a big issue in large companies. The just to take a step back, there is an exemption for employment purposes. This is where a lot of questions come from. So if you're using employee data for employment purposes, you don't need to take consent, so you can collect the data and process it. But the question then becomes, and this is analogous to what we were just discussing, is what is employment purpose and how far can you stretch that string? Yes, if you're using it for like payroll services, if you're using it for HR, this is going to be a very subjective determination on how you process the data, who processes the data, because there's usually a lot of risks, right? Like the birthday thing is a good example. Sometimes you might collect this data and just send it to HQ in another country, right? There are associated risks with coming to do that. So it'll very much be dictated to the processing activities, how you're processing it, who's given access. Those are the sort of second order questions. But as a thumb rule, I'd say, is this an employment purpose? Sometimes we've
Hmm.
seen that companies sometimes might sell add-on services, right? You might, because you work in a particular large company, a bank might want to give you an offer, or an insurance provider might want to give you like better services. Those I think are the gray area or outside of what we might consider employment services, because that's not something that you're using for an employment purpose. It's a benefit an employee might want to take, but it's not strictly related to your employment.
Got it. When you say employment purpose, are you talking about mandatory purposes of employment, like regulated purposes of employment, like Provident Fund or something like a background verification? These are all actively called out in the legitimate use provision. But let's say if I want to get you a birthday cake or offer you an on the insurance policy, then it is not. But when you say for the employment purpose, it is also possible for me to say that, okay, you know what, as part of our employee welfare, we do XYZ and that is for the employment purpose. Is there any clearer demarcation that can be made there, like a question that I can ask? And if the answer is yes or no, then I'd have to collect consent based on
So,
that.
yeah, just to add a little bit of color to that, it's not just legally mandated categories. Like your PF and
Hmm.
all of that are very straightforward, right? You wouldn't, but it's things like HR, right? If you have to pay someone's salary and to collect the bank account details, that is clearly an employment purpose. If your name has to go through like for increments or like for performance review, those are all employment purposes. I think, and again, I want to say, even for the ancillary purposes, it becomes a very subjective determination. It's hard to just say no for any particular purpose. As I was saying, you have to draw that link back to employment. And I guess the test is how is it an incidental purpose to employment or is it part of a core employment purpose? So that's why, again, going back to the birthday cake example or something, someone doing add on service and stuff like that, it's not strictly within what you would consider to be part of the core purposes of employment. And
Got
again, I
it.
want to
Got
add
it.
that this is a very subjective determination.
Yeah, so on that subjective determination, because what sort of documentation should I have around it? Because the GDPR tells me, okay, you do this legitimate interest assessment, and this is the documentation. That's how you tell your regulator that you thought this through as an organization. But in India, there is no such requirement, right? And we have these questions in chat also. That's why I'm asking you. How First level of question is, how do I know whether my correct grounds for processing is consent or legitimate use, or maybe it's an exemption? So first question is, how do I know as a reasoning person? But the second question is, how do I as an organization prove that I did this analysis to the data protection board? Because I don't think there is enough guidance on that.
Yeah, I think this goes back to what we started this conversation with, is you're not going to get clear guidance of that sort from the Indian government, or MeitY's been fairly clear. That's going to be a principle-based framework. You might find out, unfortunately, by sometimes violating the rules and as jurisprudence on this grows. But I think a good thing to do, as you were saying too, is to create a defensible position. So I think at every point, and we find that this is really the sort of internal management of data, is creating that culture, creating that sort of record keeping of, okay, we're using this data, we're using it for this purpose. So your internal privacy teams must very much be doing that. That once you map your data flows, the next step there is to then record it. That if I'm sending this data to HR is using it for this purpose. If you're sending it to legal, if you're sending it to accounting, I think once you start doing that, it becomes fairly clear. There are not a lot of cases in our experience once we start doing this deep dive and when we're doing these gap analysis. A lot of times it's fairly clear what is an employment purpose and what is not. What else you can do is, of course, contact external counsel and be happy to advise you.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think for matters that have such a high risk, I think it's totally worth it to do that. We have some more questions from the audiences about this is a very interesting question that it is actually in the webinar chat, which is a very, I think, very real question, real problem for a business, which is very simply that most businesses right now do business through third party agencies, outsourcing agencies. And we have seen those contracts. You will collect consent. If you don't collect consent, you will pay me indemnities, like you will pay my fine or you'll be liable to me. And the data that you are giving me, you are responsible for. Now, firstly, does this work anymore? If yes, or if no, why? And secondly, if it doesn't work, then what does a better arrangement look like? What someone who's the owner of risk inside this enterprise, what must they demand now?
So this is again an area where there's a lot of confusion, and there is, to be fair, a lot of ambiguity in the law as well. Because again, just to give a quick, like short recap of what happened to the law as well, I think a lot of data processor related obligations in the 2023 draft were taken out. And this is one of the consequences of it. Because if you look at GDPR and other frameworks, there's very clear role definition between a data processor and a data fiduciary. Earlier, we would just say, hey, you're a processor and you don't need to worry about a certain number of things. But now the tricky part, and these sort of outsourcing arrangements are the sort of bugbear for most companies, is figuring out who the processor is and who the fiduciary is. Because the fiduciary, as you've seen under the law, takes on most of the responsibilities, if not all. And you go back to this indemnity construct. I'll come to the enforcement of it in a bit. So then the question really becomes determining who a data fiduciary is and who the data processor is. So there the test is, and it's in the law itself, is are you making decisions about the processing of the data? Are you determining the purposes and the means for processing? So you might contract out the data collection and consent to somebody else, but are they the decision maker or are you the decision maker? And we found this becomes tricky in every single context, and each sort of sector has seen its own peculiarities. I'll give you a couple of very quick examples. We as law firms ourselves sometimes have to struggle with this question because when you do diligences, you're given access to a bunch of data, right? But you are not really the person who collected from the employee in the company. And I think auditors face the same sort of problems. Are we determining the sort of purpose and the means for this collection? Do we become data fiduciaries suddenly? So these sort of questions everyone is struggling with. And unfortunately, here also I have to say that the answer becomes subjective depending on the purpose. But I can run through solutions that we think through depending on the context. One is you go back to a traditional data fiduciary processor construct, where it's very clear that you're only processing the data. So you're only collecting consent, handing over the data. You're not making any decisions over it. Or if you are making decisions, it's based on the instructions of the data fiduciaries. Those sort of arrangements still exist in many sectors, and you can follow that construct. But in most situations, we found that it's somewhere in between. That you're collecting the data and you are making some decisions. The person who's asking to collecting the data is also making some decisions. So then what we recommend is revisiting your agreements, beefing up your data processing clauses or adding a data processing addendum where you outline that, hey, I'm the fiduciary without being so explicit for these purposes. You are the fiduciary for these purposes. So it becomes a little more nuanced. So say I'm collecting KYC data on behalf of a bank, right? And I'm a TSP or a technology service provider. It's not fair to say that I'm not doing anything with this data, right? I'm also collecting it for a purpose. I'm doing processing activities. Then you clearly outline the sort of roles and responsibilities between the bank and the TSP to say that the TSP is doing XYZ functions, the bank is doing ABC functions. So the roles and responsibilities of both parties become very clear. And going forward, I think this actually offers you much more flexibility than the earlier way in which you had a strict separation. So that is broadly what we advise in these situations. On the enforcement of indemnity clauses, that's an interesting question because most disputes people I speak to say indemnity clauses are very rarely enforced because everybody starts disputing whether there is an indemnity event or not. And I think the DPDP Act also is going to see in the future how test this out because in this construct, the indemnity clause becomes a very important determinant. So to avoid that, you take a step back and be as clear as possible in your contract.
Okay, sure. I'm now thinking as a large enterprise, probably a BFSI entity. And now, as a BFSI entity, I have delineated that, okay, I have a sort of channel partner, someone who is getting customers or leads for me, and they are doing their own things with the data. I'm doing some set of things with the lead, qualified lead that is passed on to me, and we clearly delineate these responsibilities. Now, let's say there is some sort of a breach that happens, breach of the law, data breach, or something like that happens. As a large enterprise, I would be scared that the data protection board will come for me, right? Because the small enterprise is going to shut shop and walk away from a fine. Often, like some enterprises, their annual turnover is smaller than the higher range of the penalties that are to be applied. And as a large enterprise, I'm doing a lot of business with these small enterprises. What if there's a breach on the data that we are using together? Is it fair to say that the data protection board will come for me as the large enterprise? How do I prevent the data protection board from what is enough documentation or what is enough steps that I can take to negate that risk or negate that liability in front of the data protection board as a large enterprise, as a BFSI entity?
So first of all, I want to start by saying this is not at all a theoretical question. This is already playing out before RBI and a lot of other sectors where incident reporting frameworks exist. And as India is a hotbed for cybersecurity incidents. So what we see in these cases is the same, is what you very flag very well is who do you apportion responsibility to. And some of this is a technical determination, which we rely on the help from like the engineers in the team to identify where this fault started from. So sometimes we've seen breaches happening because of the downstream provider, like a sub-processor or a processor of a sub-processor, where there's been some fault, right? So it's not really the fault of the enterprise, as you say. A lot of times you rely on those indemnity agreements. How enforceable are they? To mitigate that risk, the solution is not strictly legal at this point. You would have to do the vetting process needs to become much stricter. That's why if you look at the audit conditions that have come through the SEBI framework, through the RBI framework, the kind of audits and the kind of reporting you need to do on a regular basis for any regulated entity is becoming very strict. So I think we'll start seeing that trend across sectors. Because when you come to the point of incident reporting and trying to find out apportioned responsibilities, as you rightly said, it becomes very tricky, especially if the processor whose fault it is does not have the money to pay, and it might come back on you again. So rather than getting to that stage, I think you need to get into very clear terms of what a company is able to pay and then determine whether they're a party with which you should be sharing this kind of data. I think what has happened in the last decade is that rush to digitize everything. There's been a lot of startups or new companies which we shared data very happily, and then you deal with the consequences later. So I think that vetting process needs to become very clear. And the security measures which kind of exist in the SPDI rules, but nobody follows, getting the auditing done, getting the testing done, getting vulnerability testing done. I think my suggestion is that you need to look at these precautionary or risk mitigation measures much more seriously. Because if you're trying to answer these questions at the point of a data breach or a cybersecurity incident, it becomes really tricky. It might inevitably go into some sort of dispute or some sort of termination of contract. So the risk we highlight a lot of times to clients is not necessarily one of legal risk. It's much more of a reputational risk
Yeah.
that there might be a commercial implication to this because you suffered data breaches and you haven't resolved them to the satisfaction of your vendors, to your partners, or to your clients. And the other risk I want to highlight again with cybersecurity instances, you now have to start reporting to data principals as well. So I think over time you'll start seeing much more responsible behavior across sectors with respect to incidents.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's a great view. Just tighten up your due diligence. That is very important. And I think a lot of BFSI leaders will agree that is lacking often in a lot of onboarding scenarios. There are a lot of questions in the chat, but I just want to dwell on this topic for a bit for just one more question because it is very, very difficult. And in fact, it is very possible that there are no answers, but I think everyone here would just benefit from thinking about how you are from learning from how you are thinking about it. So my question is this: sure, I can do due diligence and I can make sure that my vendors are doing things in the right way, but in some cases the industry can be so fractured and the industry can be so unorganized that there is no way to negate the risk, but I have to do business with that industry. I'll give you an example: collections industry, right? The collections industry is very fractured at the ground level. They don't have good data handling practices. But as a lender, I need to do business with the collection industry. Now, I'm not expecting an answer in this situation, but as someone who is owning risk and compliance within this organization, how should they be thinking about this problem?
We've seen this, as you rightly point out, in a number of sectors where it's evolving. There's a lot of VC funds flowing in, so companies are willing to take the risk. In that situation, it becomes a commercial question. I don't think it's a purely legal consideration of are you willing to take that risk. You have to figure out what the fine is, figure out who you're working with, and does that fine pay off in comparison to whatever benefits you might gain. And this happens across sectors, right? What you pointed out is right. We've seen a lot of sectors where developers working on cutting edge tech are too small, but the sort of benefits or the incremental benefits to your business, to your customers, the value you're delivering outweighs the risk. I think you have to get into those sort of calculations. I think you find better answers from the business people on this call rather than a lawyer, strictly speaking.
Makes sense. So keep the risk in mind and keep the business goal in mind and do those risk-based analysis. Maybe in regulated spaces, we can expect some guidance from the regulators also.
Yeah.
But yeah, school. Yeah, just spend some time on this third-party risk because it's a vexing issue. I don't think anybody has a clear answer for this. And as you said, it's a trade-off. It's a matter of balance. So coming to my next question about consent, we are getting a lot of questions. Please keep those questions coming in. I will try to ask them in different times and fit them into my conversation with Puneeth. Yeah, coming to consent, one final question. So far, the Indian industry has been used to bundle consent, tick box, privacy policy. I will use your data for whatever I want to, and list of purposes and everything are there, but there's a privacy policy and it is a bundled consent. There's just one tick box and we are used to it. We prefer that our customer journeys, digital or phygital, are all designed around this one checkbox. Now, if I have to take granular consent and open up this bundled consent into a granular consent, when do I collect this consent? For what do I collect this consent? And how many times do I collect this consent becomes the issue. So, for example, if I'm a big BFSI company, I'm using data in a lot of ways. Maybe like my parent entity has a banking company, a lending company, an insurance company, an investment company, and there are other products, right? Even if I'm in the e-commerce space or in the manufacturing, like OEM sort of space or FMCG space, there also I'm across multiple brands. Some of those brands are running independently. Some of those brands are running under my umbrella brand. So, for regardless of the industry that you're in, a large enterprise offers so many different products and so many different services and so many different flows. So how should they think about collecting consent? Can they collect one big consent at the first customer touch point that covers everything that the customer will ever do when they are interacting with that business, or should they take just in time small consents at different phases, keeping in mind the customer experience, keeping in mind what the modality of collecting that consent would look like? What is your advice?
To answer this, I'll go back to the very first question of what should companies be doing right now. It's doing exactly what you just described. It's figuring out all your data flows, figuring out where you need consent and how do you need consent. Because I can assure you, this is a subjective exercise for every company. As you said, some company can offer like 5 different services, work with 10 different processors. Mapping that data flows and figuring out where the data is flowing is the hardest part. Coming to the consent point, and that's the other reason why I said this requires a cultural shift. As you were saying, right now we follow a tick box approach because there's no enforcement risk. We put in 40 kinds of purposes into it and say we're collecting data for all of it. That is going to have to stop. So you have to make that internal assessment that if I'm selling 5 products, What is the likelihood of person purchasing this product? How long will I need to hold on to this data for? What are the purposes for which I need a consent? I think you need to internally have a clear sense of that before you get to the consent point. Because the legal guidance on this is very clear. You need to get consent prior to collecting data for the purposes and for the duration for which you're going to use that data to provide those services. After that, there's a whole question of retention that comes up that I don't want to go into just now. So when we do gap analysis for companies, when we do this for like large enterprises, this is exactly the time, this is exactly the question on which you spend the most amount of time. Because as you said, data records exist in both physical and digital forms. Consent may have been taken like 20 years ago, 30 years ago. That's why the sort of look back notice is required. And it may have been collected for an entirely different purpose. One thing that the Act offers is a sort of clean slate. You can restart and just provide people with a list of things for which you already collect the data. And then it goes back to whether the customer agrees to that or not. But I think mapping those data flows, figuring out who holds the data, who you've sent the data to, the purpose of which you're collecting it is the most important part. The second thing you need to prepare for is a second order effect is that data principals will have more of a say and maybe they say no to some purposes. And I think with more information, and we've seen this when we help companies respond to grievances that they receive, someone might see a lot of marketing purposes and a lot of sort of tracking happening. They might turn around and say, I don't want to give you data for this. You might have to work that into your contingency plan that you might not get consent for everything and figure out what are the real purposes for which you need it and make sure your consent notice is drafted very clearly. And again, you can still collect data. This is not, that's what I want. We keep reassuring clients. This does not stop you from collecting data. You just have to be much more transparent about it.
Yeah, yeah. I think transparency and control, these are the key things that the act is offering to to the end users, to the consumers. So yeah, very fair. It's a subjective call. I think we can all agree that bundled consent is passe for now. And we are at a stage where granular consent needs to be collected. What is the scope of consent? When exactly do you collect consent? That is a subjective call. You're going to have to take that based on your flows and based on your solutioning. Thanks for pointing out the stuff that people should keep in mind when they're breaking this down, right? Like, what are they going to do if the consent is not granted? What are the opportunities that they will have to collect the consent, right? What is the touch point that they're going to have with the customer? Is it a digital touch point? Is it a physical touch point? And based on that, there needs to be a strategy that needs to be created around consent collection. And that strategy then needs to be technically implemented across the board. So that is the work that should be done right now. On that note, we'll launch a poll. For our audiences, how are you planning to collect consent in your journeys? Are you planning on taking one broad consent? Are you taking specific consents based on where the user is doing their journey? Or are you taking a broad consent for the common purposes that your parent entity is going to use the data for, and then flow specific or product specific consents wherever it is required? Please provide your responses and we'll share the data with you. All right. So on that note, I'm just going to take a minute to go over. I think there's a translations question here. We can touch upon the translations question. So, do I have to show my notice in all the 22 languages? Do I show it in the languages of the region? Do I pick out the languages of my customer segment and then show it? What is the right way to do this?
So I used to give a different answer until I saw the tools that you have built. So I think you should take a look at what Pushkal and their team are doing. They have a very quick solve for this. They have an auto translation option, which we've trialed ourselves and works very well. But yes, I think the letter of the law and intermediaries started facing this right after the 2021 guidelines, where they had to put in all eight schedule languages. What we've recommended in the past is if you're manually doing this, is adopt that risk-based approach. Where are most of your customers coming from? Where are you likely to receive requests from for translation? Because this again happens at the option of the customer or the data principal. So if they ask you for it, you will have to provide it. The law does not contemplate an alternative. And this also comes from the fact that we live in a country with so much diversity and people just speak and live in different languages. So yes, if you read the law strictly, you have to have it available, and there are tools that help you get it very quickly. Otherwise, what you advised in the past is figure out if you're operating in four states, make sure the languages of those states are available on your platform, and then see response on a case-to-case basis based on data principal requests.
Okay, got it. So earlier you would advise to look and do it on a case-to-case basis, do an analysis, but now seeing how simple things are on Consentin, you think that you can just go ahead and translate in different languages. Yeah, I'm just going to do a shameless plug here. for everybody who's viewing, there are a lot of questions here about how do you operationalize data principal rights, how do you operationalize these consent collection and different flows, even in third party flows, and when data is being shared. You should definitely sign up for our pilot program, or you should reach out to us. We have a very simple solve for all of these questions. Our goal is to simplify DPDP compliance for businesses. But without spending too much time on making the pitch, I will come back to the questions. One thing that has also been asked, a couple of things around consent that have been asked in the chat also, and some few things I wanted to talk about also. You mentioned look back consent, and you said that the DPDP Act is giving you an opportunity to for everyone to come to a level playing field. I suppose you're talking about a one-time notice, where one-time notice says for consents that are collected prior to the act coming into force, you can send your principals a one-time notice telling them how you're processing their data, and basically give them a notice and give them a preference center, give them an option to withdraw their consent. The problem there is that this covers only consents that are collected in the past. Now, we know that under the SPDI rules, it is possible to read it in a way where you need to collect consent only for sensitive personal data and not for all personal data. It is possible to do that. Now, maybe some businesses have taken that reading, right? So maybe they have personal data where they don't have consent. Now, what do these people have to do? Do they have to collect consent afresh, or can they send a one-time notice, or do they not do it? What do they do?
Okay. To start off with, just a quick clarification, because we've seen many people mix this up. It's a look back notice. It's not a look back consent. So you don't have to take consent again. As Pushkal rightly pointed out, you simply have to provide a notice of the data points you've collected and give people an opportunity to withdraw the consent. On this question of PD, which was PD under the SPDA Act, for which you strictly didn't need consent, and now you do. As you again pointed out, some of our clients who are willing to take more of a risk have taken that sort of clever loophole where you technically don't need consent because you're not processing data on the basis of consent. But I want to emphasize again that simply comes down to your risk appetite. Are you willing to take that risk? Because it's very possible that once the data protection board is set up, they might turn around and say, hey, stop this. This is not okay. And are you willing to take the risk down the line of this facing some regulatory action? The reason I keep saying the look back notice offers a clean slate is if you just provide that data point and say, I've collected this data, and give people an option to withdraw consent without actually collecting consent, you've covered yourself a little bit. You've created a defensible position. In the event that somebody comes back tomorrow and says, hey, but you didn't take consent for it, you can point out that you did provide notice. You did give people an option to withdraw consent. And while that not be the notice that's there in the DPDP Act, it's not the exact format, it is sufficient in my view that you can go back and say, I have given notice, the data principal knows, and they've chosen to keep this data with us.
Yeah, that's a practical reading of a rather unclear provision. Definitely. That's how we would read it as well. But it's good to hear it from you. Good to hear it from you as well. I think simple answer here is that even if you have not collected consent, just send out the one-time notice, give everybody a preference center. It is satisfying the core of the requirement, even though it may be dicey on the wording. So yeah, that's a very good, clear answer.
Sorry, Pushkal, Puneeth, just on this,
Yeah.
it was a question we received when before the webinar started. I think it may have got missed in chat on this point. If someone withdraws their consent in in the look back notice and it affects delivery of services, and I think this question we received for new consent as well. What do they do about the services that are contingent on the consent?
So on this, there is a provision of the act that makes it very clear that when a data principal withdraws consent, they agree to bear the consequences of that withdrawal. So say, for instance, I've signed up to a delivery service and I say, delete my address. You can't actually deliver anything to that person, right? So it becomes the data principal's responsibility then. You do have no obligation to continue providing services to them. The only thing I'd point out there is you have to be careful about when you use this option. You can't use it for all kinds of data. You should be able to prove that you actually can't provide services based on this. So again, if I'm a bank and I've said delete like 3 of my old addresses, but keep the one that you have now, you can't turn around and say, I can't provide you services anymore. So I think you have to do that internal assessment of what data you absolutely need to provide services. And if someone's saying stop marketing services, stop personalizing, customization, I don't think you would take a view that based on that you can stop services.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think this is a question that a lot of product teams need to be scratching their heads over. what is the data that we absolutely need? What data relates to what service? But along the same lines, just one more question that, sure, there are something like a delivery of goods, and for delivery of goods, I need your consent. And if you don't give me your consent, I cannot deliver your goods. That's fine. But what about regulatory requirements, right? So regulatory requirements, I cannot, like, technically the law doesn't allow you to come in and withdraw your consent for KYC, for example, for storing KYC data or something like that, or withhold your consent for KYC. So in that case, is that consent mandatory for the end user?
Okay, that's a tricky question, but I'd go back to the principle again. Is without KYC, the government doesn't allow me to create an account for you. So it would not necessarily be based on the fact that you're not withholding consent. You'd have a specific law, which is the RBI requirement for KYC. You're not meeting the requirements of that law. So you can't technically open an account. So the question of consent is secondary to that. So in case of regulatory requirement, you'll have to read it alongside that. And if the law requires you to collect a certain amount of data and somebody says no, then that person is not eligible to receive those services, leave alone their ability to consent and withdraw consent.
Hmm. Sure. And this may be maybe a bit too like silly a question, but if you look at legitimate uses in India in under the DPDP Act, it doesn't exactly say for compliance with the legal requirement. It says for compliance with the legal disclosure requirement, but it doesn't say for compliance with the legal requirement. So they are probably saying you still have to collect consent. You can retain it for a legal requirement. It just appears that way. Maybe I'm missing something. Like, could you help me with that question?
So this is again, I start with the examples of law firms doing diligences and audits. This is the exact question on which we are stuck as well. And we have to make a determination on a case-by-case basis on what kinds of data, what data flows. I can assure you there's no clear answer to this. Many representations have been made to the government. Unfortunately, there's no clear answer at this point. To go back to the situation of auditors and stuff being treated as data processors otherwise. If you wanted to give it a purposive interpretation, you can, of course, read it the way you just said it, to say that in these situations, you don't actually need consent because you're doing it actually to fulfill a lawful purpose, but that there is that ambiguity there, and it's not the understanding that's there in GDPR and other frameworks.
Got it. Got it. I think we have you for 10 more minutes. So I want to spend time on a couple of topics, and one of them is retention. This has come up. The law, this is one of the biggest technical challenges I feel that businesses will face, because the law brings in a delete by default requirement. Basically, earlier regulators would prescribe a minimum retention period, that if you have so and so data, you have to retain it for a minimum of so many years, so that for your auditing and for your record keeping or legal requirements or something like that. But now the law brings in a delete by default requirement. There's a clear guidance that if you don't have valid grounds or a legal requirement to process the data, then you delete it. That's covered in consent withdrawal, also it's covered in different cases. So this is a huge change, technically speaking. So how does one begin creating an ideal retention policy? Is it enough to just have expiry on your consents and then delete the data then, or do you need something more sophisticated?
So to start off with, I'm not sure that I agree with that categorization. I think there are some ambiguities and the provisions are phrased very weirdly. But I think the rules still remain the same, and it's largely consistent with global practice, where if you have a lawful purpose, you can retain it for as long as you need. So if you have a customer relationship, it's clear you can retain it. You can even retain it beyond that purpose for a regulatory purpose. And I want to tell you that the regulatory purposes for which people retain is almost infinite, because every new sector we speak to, we figure out that there's some requirement for which they have to retain for customs purposes, for some regulatory inspections. So they're also looking at a much more extended period. So here you have to take a couple of steps back in terms of thinking of your retention policy, of what purpose are you collecting this data for. At that point, it'll become very clear for how long you would need it. And most businesses, most sophisticated businesses would have a clear sense, right? That if I'm a business in the FMCG sector, this is how long my customers stay with me for. If I'm a business in like a fintech sector, this is how long business customers stay with me for. So you already have a certain sense of how long you retain customers for, and your retention period, you can link to that within a certain amount of giving yourself a certain amount of leeway. So I don't know that it's delete by default. I think it to be fair to the government, it's a reaction to people retaining data for prolonged periods of time. Because I'm sure everyone's been through this. I had an internet service provider when I lived in a different city, and I still get messages from them. It's to solve for problems like that. If you have
So
a
what should
very
that internet service provider do? With the DPDP Act coming out, you have moved your city. Of course, they should stop sending you messages. That is obvious. But how should they organize their data in a way that they don't send you messages? But if the try comes to them tomorrow and asks them to see their roles, they still have it. What should that internet provider do?
with an internet service provider, it's much more straightforward, right? You terminate the relationship when you move a city or when you move houses and you're not serviced in that area, or I've just chosen to terminate that service. And this is exactly the kind of purposes where the government wants to be more strict. If the contractual relationship is terminated, there is no reason why you should hold on to that data, right? Unless you have a regulatory purpose for which you're retaining it. Unless TRI says hold it for 3 more years, hold the CDRs for investigation purposes and stuff like that. But otherwise, there's no commercial reason to hold on to that either, right?
Got it. Got it. And of course, deletion may not entirely mean deletion for a technical person. Deletion is a really horrible thing that you tell them that what I have to delete my data. No, that is a very bad thing. That's not only because businesses like data and they build business models on top of data, but also because systems are designed on top of data behaving in a certain way. And if you delete, for example, if you delete a user profile, all the records associated with that user profile will start behaving weirdly. So it actually creates issues in the system. So what does it really mean to delete personal data? Like from a practical within an enterprise, what methods would you ask an enterprise to use if consent is withdrawn or if the relationship is terminated? Yeah.
So I go back again to the very first question. This is why the data mapping exercise becomes really crucial. And when you delete, you only have to delete personal information, not any information that will help you identify the client. So if you're looking at a user profile and say you have, just for the sake of argument, 50 data points, but only 5 of them are really data, personal data that will help you identify a person, you can delete that data and you can still draw inferences from the other 45 kinds of data, right? So again, to go back to a few examples of analytics that you run, you don't always need personal information for that. So if you're trying to identify traffic flows as a rideshare app, you don't need a person's personal information all the time. You have root data already, and you can always anonymize that data and continue to draw the analytics that you do and personalized services. I guess what that ends up doing is maybe you won't be able to offer the kind of customizations you did earlier, not super customized services, but you can still one level removed do a fair amount of customization for a particular area. And we know that businesses already do this. So I guess what you have to keep in mind is how much of the personal information do you absolutely need to retain, and figure out ways in which you can anonymize the remaining information. And most importantly, I'd say the biggest risk comes from reaching out to customers. To go back to the internet service provider example, or to go back to the action that TRI, SEBI, RBI take from time to time, it's because a lot of businesses go back and pester customers. So to go back to your customer touch points, go back to what kinds of personal information you collect, separate all of that out, and you still have a large wealth of data that you're still sitting on.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Puneet, we're at the end of our time. In my document, I have so many other questions that I wanted to ask you. Perhaps we'll have to have the rest of this conversation offline as we have in the past. I just want to take these last few minutes to give you the floor. You have been seeing the sort of questions that people have been asking, and I don't want to limit your responses to them by my questions. Is there anything that you'd like to, any piece of advice that you'd want to give to the participants in this webinar about how simple sort of approach to how they should approach compliance? Or if not, then maybe if you can just talk about your experience with at this webinar and in having this discussion, and then we can wrap it up.
Sure. Thanks so much, Pushkal. I think I'll want to emphasize again is it's important to understand what sort of a business you're in, what sector you're in, how placed you are currently. I don't think anybody starting from scratch, especially given how many businesses are digital. I want to tell you the last few companies that we've done these exercises for are not digital companies, right? They work in very offline sectors and have an online layer. So if they can figure it out, I'm sure a lot of the sort of fintech and other people I see in the questions can figure it out very easily. What you have to figure out are what are the incremental changes that you need to make, whether your starting point is SPDI or GDPR, and what are the internal processes you need to set in place, because a lot of the legal questions come really at the end. They're the tip of the iceberg. The processes you put in place dictate what sort of issues you run into. In terms of ambiguity, other than the 4 or 5 questions that we just discussed, right, around retention, around consent, other than figuring out whether data producer, data processor, a lot of the other compliances in this law are actually business friendly. Just speaking about my experiences, the earlier drafts of the law and the stuff that we discussed before the GPC were fast strict, I can assure you. And the kinds of things they wanted people to do were frankly, they seem a little difficult. I'd say, as I said in the beginning, you should be thinking about compliance and organizing your data, mapping your data flows, because that's the real first and most important step in compliance.
Fantastic, fantastic. I guess you're saying that start solving the technical questions. Don't procrastinate because the rules are not here. There are enough technical questions, and as you rightly said, the legal ambiguities are actually the tip of the iceberg. The more difficult questions are the technical questions. So thank you so much, Puneeth, for that. I always enjoy talking to you, and I hope we have more such conversations, whether they are broadcasted or not. I think on behalf of everybody who's on this on this webinar, we've learned a lot with how you have grappled with these questions. Of course, they were purposely a little bit ambiguous, or they were touching about problems that people had, businesses would have in implementing. And I think you have provided a lot of clarity, at least as much as you can, in a general discussion. A lot of it is super subjective and based on your flows. And in those cases, you should seek help of people like Puneeth, who are grappling with these problems, or people who are grappling with these problems in a very practical way, working with the largest and the best businesses in the country. And when it comes to some technical solves around this, you should definitely reach out to us at Consentin. We have solved a lot of these problems around withdrawal of consents, around third party risks. How do you make sure that you can protect liability in these cases? How do you make sure that you allow people to withdraw their consents or exercise right to access? How do you collect consent in different cases? We'll be happy to walk you through our product and offerings. With that, any questions that we could not answer, as I promised, we will share responses with you. So if you have asked a question, it will be answered. If not, if it hasn't been answered, you will get an answer in your email. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending this session and making it super interactive and for asking these great questions. Thank you again, Puneeth, for taking out the time to be with us. I think Patel has something to say.
Just to recap, got a lot of questions, I think more than we anticipated. So I think we've answered some, but we've not answered a lot. So we will, as Pushkal mentioned, be sharing a document with answer to each and every question. And we'll be sharing the recording of this webinar. We got a few questions about whether we'll share minutes. We'll share one FAQ document and a recording of the webinar by the weekend. So just keep a track on your email inbox. Check your spam also. Sometimes mails from, say, webinar hosts do go into spam. So just be on the lookout for a mail from either Avisha or Pushkal. You will get the mail. We will answer every question. Pushkal and Puneeth will sit and look through the questions and answer them, and we'll give you a written doc. Don't worry.
Thanks so much, Pushkal. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you so much, Puneeth. Thank you, everybody.
Pushkal,
I think
if you actually have 5 minutes, we can maybe take some of the Q&A questions. If people, because unless people are dropping off. I think
sure. Yeah, sure. Let me just go over the questions.
We'll do it.
We had Puneeth for a limited time, but I think I can just open the chat and go over some of these questions.
Yeah. We'll give quick answers now and we'll give detailed answers in the document.
Yes. So if an AI company processes end user data on behalf of another company, is the AI company required to obtain consent? That is not required unless the AI company uses that data as training data. What the best AI companies do is that for large enterprises, they would offer them sort of private instances of the model, which cannot be used to train the personal data. If train the model in a later sort of version, if you're an AI company that is using the data that you're collecting for training, collecting through your client, if you're using this data for your training, and then if that involves some personal information, and if there is by chance a leak of that personal information, then you will definitely be at risk. So that is something that you need to ensure that doesn't happen. That can be done through masking or something like that. How can data processors mitigate risk? So this is something that we touched upon about specifically for data processors. All the requirements for risk mitigation, etc., will come in through contracts. What you need to do is you need to identify a security standard that you want to adhere to, get audited for it, and make sure that you comply with those requirements. This will ensure a baseline of compliance, but the rest of your requirements will come from your clients. The rest of your requirements will be implemented contractually. If the DPDP has not yet been enforced, what enforcement trends should we anticipate from the DPA regarding consent notices? There is some direction already about consent notices under the draft rules. We don't expect that to change much. So you need to tell about what service you're offering or product. You need to tell what purposes. You need to tell what data categories. You need to give a link to the preference center, link to make a grievance, link to complain to the board. The notice should be readable separately, downloadable, and it should be available in 22 languages. This is by and large what is going to be there. This is what you can expect going forward as well. Anonymized data we've already touched upon. How do you practically determine when data is sufficiently anonymized, given that there's no statutory test? That is a great question. According to some latest research papers, most anonymization can be broken. Like it is an entire field of cryptography to be able to successfully anonymize data. And a lot of anonymization can be broken. But at the same time, there are some basic anonymization standards that are out there. So without getting too academic about this, you can pick an anonymization standard or a tokenization standard and use that for your de-identification. And that should be enough under the Act. The Act doesn't give you a test. As Puneeth mentioned, it's a principle-based approach. They will give you the broad guidelines, but you need to pick out exactly which standard you're going to comply with. How to adopt a mechanism to enable SPDI providers to access, review, correct, and modify, and to withdraw consent. So this mechanism, so it's very easy to implement using Consentin. If you are interested in understanding how this works, you can book a demo with us and we will walk you through it. It's a no obligation demo. We'll be happy to just have a chat with you. In fact, if you're a small enterprise, we have a free plan for small enterprises. So if you're collecting less than 3,000 consents monthly, you can literally implement legality for free and legality consent in for free. And I can't think of a better offer than that if you're a small enterprise. So do get in touch with us and we'll help you set it up. Even if you're a large enterprise, you can do our pilots or you can have discussions with us. Those are all free and no obligations. How fiduciary make sure processor actions like use of data. So I think the question here is that how do you make sure that the processor has done something that you've asked them to do? For example, if you ask them to delete data, then how do you make sure that they've done it? The answer is documentation. You have to have a method to collect the verification of against each instruction that you're giving to the processor, and this has to be worked into your contracts. This method can be automated. Again, if you use Consentin, you can use Consentin to solve for this. How do you differentiate between the consent manager and the consent management system? So consent manager is a big topic that we wanted to get into with Puneeth, but we do not have the time. At this point, a consent manager is a specifically registered entity that is specifically defined under the Act to help with data transfers. But a consent management system can be used by anybody, can be implemented by anybody. So that is a very simple sort of differentiation. Consent managers are way more specific and they have a more specific function and it is set out in the rules. It's a long topic, so I'm just being quick about it. The next question we have answered already. Independent distributors often collect data. How can you ensure that this data is protected? You have to do your due diligence. Puneeth has answered this question. You have to do your due diligence. You have to tighten your contracts. And if you want to safeguard yourselves, you have to collect documentation about verification from them that they have followed your instructions. And that will ensure that you're able to safeguard yourself in such cases. I'll just withdrawal impact service delivery. This is something that we touched upon. So I'll skip this question. For existing users who have provided consent before the Act, this is also something that we touched upon. So I'll skip this part. When do we have to show notice and consent, collect consent, and then after collect data? How does this work now? So you have to show notice and collect consent before you start processing data. That's how it is supposed to work. So before, the first thing that a user should do is to give you consent. Government sources have claimed that rule will be released tomorrow. What is the expected time frame? Your guess is as good as mine. We don't know, and we don't want to predict now. It may come out at any time. It may come out right after this session. We have no idea. I'll just look at some some chat also. Yeah, I'm just speed answering these questions. Under the rules required to obtain. Under the rules, is the data fiduciary required to obtain a consent from data principal to continue providing services and allow transactions, even if a data fiduciary obtained the consent at the time of onboarding? If yes, what can be done if the data principal refuses to give consent? This is actually a common, please give references from the Act, draft rules, anything issued by the ministry. So this is a common question that we often get. You don't have to take consent for each transaction. This has been clarified by the ministry even when all these payment gateways ask for exemptions. You have to take a consent for a purpose. The purpose can be broad enough to cover all the actions that happen under that purpose. So if you take consent for marketing, you don't have to take consent for each marketing communication. If you take consent for providing a particular service, you don't have to take consent. Zomato doesn't have to take consent every time they deliver the order. Zomato has to take consent when you download and use the Zomato app. So you have to take that consent once, but of course, the purposes for which you take consent has to be granular. Is there any predefined consents? No, as Puneeth said, it is a principle-based law. So there is no predefined list of consents. Of course, if you are operating within a regulated space, then there may be such a predefined list that is available to you. For example, account aggregators have purpose codes against which data is collected, or RAI provides some specific purposes or preferences that a user can exercise. But in the general space, no, there are no specific predefined consents. You have to define them yourself. Or if you're using a tool like Consentin, we can give you some industry standard purposes that you can use depending on which sector you're working in. Can a standalone individual data, for example, location alone or say name alone, can be considered PII? We covered this. There's a subjective call based on how you're using the data, based on the purpose for which the data is used. Other questions in the comments we have covered about employment, how much time government will give to prepare organizations. They have mentioned 18 to 24 months, but it doesn't say when it started. You can expect about maybe maximum 1 more year for preparation. What are the practical steps? I think for to comply with the DPDP Act, I think a lot of those we discussed today. The key thing that you need to target right now, if there's one takeaway, it is to do your data mapping. Because once you've done your data mapping, then you can know all the problems that you need to solve for, and then you can start solving those problems. So if you're starting right now, do your data mapping. That would be the immediate next step. Being a regulated entity, we have outsourcing agreements. We've covered outsourcing. This is about outsourcing the consent collected to third parties. We covered that in the webinar. You'll see that in the recording. Data fiduciary has a lot of responsibility, but is it important to make the data processor liable through indemnity? Or should the data protection be mutual? If yes, is it against DPDP? Great question. We tried answering this in the webinar as well. Personally, I don't think that indemnities will work. Like businesses, like smaller businesses can just shut shop and walk away. And as Puneeth said, that there's not much indemnity enforcement that happens in India. What you need to do is implement enough audits and controls and automations to make sure that you don't have to worry about this problem. Like basically, you have to deal with this proactively and not reactively. You cannot think about this once some breach has happened. That is not the time to think about this. You have to think about what are the right controls that I can implement right now to minimize my liability, and what mechanisms can I build upon this. With Consentin, we provide a lot of these controls and these mechanisms based on our legal and privacy expertise. So you should, if this is something that you want to explore further, you should book a demo with us, and we will be happy to talk to you about this. What are the top 3 changes that need to be amended in existing service agreements? There are a lot of changes. You have to specify the scope of services. You have to specify what personal data is being used, and you have to specify retention, deletion mechanisms that will be, and that need to be put in place. That is different. And of course, you need to set very clear breach reporting mechanisms, which already should be there in your contract. How critical is the role of a data protection officer, and what if they are not assigned? So this is something that I wanted to touch on today with Puneeth, but we could not. Data protection officers become like play a central role. As we discussed today, it is a technical, DPDP Act poses a technical problem and poses a operational problem, and legal ambiguities are just the tip of the iceberg. The way to achieve compliance is a lot of technical and operational problems. But who is going to get these people to solve these problems? Who is going to be able to communicate these problems across various departments in a large enterprise? That is the job of the data protection officer. They are supposed to be empowered enough and be an evangelist within the organization to sensitize everybody, to tell everybody what is the importance of all of this, and more importantly, what do they need to do, and give them very clear requirements as to what they should do, and coordinate that those goals are met. So that's why the role of a data protection officer is very critical inside an organization. For academic discussions, do the rules demotivate small players? It's anybody's view. I don't think so. I think this law is very business friendly, and the small players have practically no requirements unless they are in the B2C space. It largely places most of the requirements on the larger businesses. Who determines what's a data fiduciary? A data fiduciary is someone who decides what is going to be done with the data. It's very difficult to decide. It's very difficult to have a general rule for it, but who's making the decisions? Who's bringing the customer? That is usually the data fiduciary. A company engages a background verification company for a background check. Does the employer and the service provider become co-data fiduciary? No. The employer is the data fiduciary. The service provider is not a data fiduciary until and unless they decide to use the data for their own business or something like that. For example, if using that data, they start sending real estate ads, the service provider starts sending real estate ads to the employees, then the service provider becomes a fiduciary, but otherwise it's the employer who's the fiduciary. Or, for example, a marketplace and a payment aggregator. So, payment aggregator is a very wide term. Lots of businesses operate under that. So, not entirely sure which way it will go. In direct selling, independent distributors, okay, repeat of the previous question. When are the rule getting enforced? We don't know. What happens if the existing customer refuses to give consent? So, existing customers don't have to give consent, they have to be shown a notice. That is a key point of the one-time notice. It's not a consent, it's a notice, right? So they can go and withdraw their consent. And when it comes to withdrawal of consent, then the bit Puneeth said about whether it's important for your service. If it's important for your service, then you cannot provide them the service. You have to tell them that you cannot provide them the service. And that's how the flow will work. So it is not possible that an existing customer refuses to give consent. An existing customer can withdraw their consent. And if that is the case, you can stop providing them the service. Of course, if you have to retain data for legal and regulatory purposes, then that's a different story altogether. And as Puneeth said, you probably can do that. I think that covers a lot. That was a rapid fire answering question. We will
Give more details.
give more details in the documents.
Great. Thanks, Pushkal.
Sure. Thanks everyone. Thanks, Patel. Bye bye.